Hello, and thank you for tuning into this lecture presented by the 2021 Miami World Music Festival. My name is Federico Bonacossa, and I am a composer and guitarist and a professor at the Florida International University School of Music. In this lecture, I will be discussing works by three contemporary composers that have very different styles and approaches to composition. I was asked to give a talk on contemporary music in general, but rather than try to give a comprehensive overview of the contemporary musical landscape, which is incredibly diverse and complex, I have chosen to simply introduce a handful of works that I find interesting and that represent some of the various genres one might come across today. This will give me an opportunity to discuss various aspects of contemporary music, such as notation, the use of electronics, and alternative tuning systems, all of which apply to many other works. Unless you're involved or have an interest in contemporary music, there's a good chance that the composers I will discuss will be unfamiliar to you. If that's the case, I do hope that through this introduction you'll become curious enough to explore more of their work, and of course the work of other living composers. All the works I will discuss were written in the last few years by composers who are still very much active. So you can easily learn more about them by, for example, going to their website or searching their names on YouTube. To make this a bit easier, I will provide links to each composer's website as we go along. Let's start with alternative tuning systems. The first work I will be discussing is a composition by Marc Sabat. Marc Sabat is a Canadian composer currently based in Berlin, Germany, where he has lived since 1999. Much of his work deals with just intonation. The term just intonation describes a particular approach to tuning that is based on relationships found naturally in a harmonic series. Since I suspect at least some of you will not be familiar with this, here's a brief explanation of how this works. What you see here are the first 13 notes of a harmonic series. This particular series is built on the note A, A2 to be specific. The low A at the beginning of the series is what we call the fundamental. To generate a harmonic series, we simply multiply the frequency of the fundamental, in this case 110 Hz, by 2, 3, 4, and so on. The harmonic series is not, by the way, just an abstract concept. It is something we all experience all the time. Anytime we pluck a string on the guitar or sing a note, for example, we actually produce a harmonic series. But because of how the frequencies relate to one another in the fundamental, we tend to perceive the series as one single sound rather than a set of distinct pitches. A few important things happen in a harmonic series. First, the pitches get closer and closer as you go up in the series, eventually becoming so close together that we can hardly tell them apart. But another important aspect that is quite relevant to any musician that wishes to use a harmonic series as musical material, as Marc Sabat does, is that other than the fundamental and its octave transpositions, which correspond to the powers of 2 in the series, 2, 4, 8, 16, etc., fall outside, some more than others, of 12-tone equal temperament, which is a standard tuning system used in Western music. This is the system all of our instruments are tuned to. In 12-tone equal temperament, the octave, the space between the first two harmonics in the series, is divided into 12 equal steps. This has certain important advantages, but it does compromise the purity of the intervals. In simple terms, this means that on a piano tuned in a standard way, you can only approximate the pitch relationships found naturally in a harmonic series, except of course, the octave. In order to measure the distance between notes, we often divide each of the 12 steps in an octave into 100 cents. This allows us to say things like, This note is 10 cents sharper than a standard C. The numbers you see above some of the notes in a harmonic series indicate the deviation in cents from the corresponding 12-tone equal-tempered note. So why would a composer bother to use the ratios found in the harmonic series if it clearly can present some serious practical problems? The answer is simply that the intervals, this is what we call the frequency ratio between two pitches, found in a harmonic series have a distinct and purer sound. The simple explanation for this is that in just intonation, the ratios between the intervals are simpler than in 12-tone equal temperament. In general, the simpler the ratio between two frequencies, the more consonant an interval will be. But this is in a sense just the beginning. One does not need to use the notes of a harmonic series as they appear in the series, for instance, as a sort of a scale. The ratios found in a harmonic series, for example, between the fourth and fifth harmonic, which corresponds to a pure major third, or between the fourth and seventh harmonic, which is a septimal minor seventh, can be applied to any pitch derived from another pure interval, making the possibilities truly endless. Music in just intonation can be both far more consonant and far more dissonant than music composed using 12-tone equal temperament, because there are many more possible relationships. Composers working in just intonation will often go through great lengths to be able to use these pure intervals. This includes retuning instruments, as Lamont Young and many others have done, building custom instruments, as Harry Parch has done, or using electronic instruments. One additional possibility, and this is what Marc Sabat has done in Plain Sound Duet, is to use instruments that do not have fixed tuning. Strings and voices are a common choice. This is not, however, quite as simple as it may seem. String players and vocalists are not trained to sing in just intonation, though they will often sing pure intervals without even thinking. Think, for example, of barbershop quartets. For this reason, composers will often establish a close relationship with performers that are willing to put in the time and effort required to learn and play this kind of music. As you can see, this topic can get rather complicated easily. The end result is really very unique, and I personally do believe that the results are well worth the effort. Before we look at Marc Sabat's piece, let me just mention a few things about the notation. If you're familiar at all with music notation, you probably notice that some of the accidentals, sharps and flats, are a bit odd. This is because the standard Western notation system does not accurately express pure ratios. Marc Sabat, together with composer Wolfgang von Schweinitz, has developed his own notation system for just intonation. For those of you interested, more information on this can be found on Marc Sabat's website, where scores and recordings of his works can also be downloaded. You'll probably notice that this work is reminiscent of 16th century polyphonic music. This is clearly intentional. It's a contrapuntal work written for two independent voices for two unspecified instruments. The rhythm is relatively simple, and there are no dynamic or tempo indications that you would normally find in great numbers in contemporary scores. The focus is clearly on pitch. These are all things that are common in medieval and Renaissance music, but despite all this, the music sounds really very modern and fresh. Sabat uses contrapuntal techniques that were very common in early polyphonic music. In the very opening measures, for example, part 1 and 2 invert roles so that part 1 plays in measure 1, a transposition of what part 2 plays in measure 2, and vice versa. In addition, the intervals of the parts are inverted, creating a sort of mirror image. Lastly, in the first system, I have labeled the interval ratios that result from the combination of the two parts. The ratios used are all found early on in the harmonic series. Let's now listen to the work, which is about 5 minutes long. The next work I want to discuss was written by American composer Eleni Lilios. The majority of Lilios' works are either purely electroacoustic, which essentially means that they do not require a performer to be performed, or combine electronics with one or more live performers. Electroacoustic music has been around for quite some time now, but it is still today rarely heard in concert halls. Many of the most well-known composers of the 20th century, for instance, John Cage, Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, Milton Babbitt, Toru Takemitsu, Luciano Berio, etc., were also early pioneers of electronic music. Electronic music is, of course, an integral part of commercial and film music, and we hear it every day, but for whatever reason, classical musicians are often resistant to it, perhaps because they are rarely exposed to it in school. The ability to process the sound of a live instrument in complex and predictable ways has really become possible only relatively recently, thanks to personal computers becoming increasingly more powerful and affordable. What used to take hours of work in an electronic studio can be done in seconds on a modern laptop. Software applications and digital instruments of all kinds have become available and more affordable. In fact, many musicians now use the computer as their primary instrument. Combining a traditional instrument with electronic opens up many new possibilities. For example, the sound of a live instrument can be transposed, delayed, distorted, looped, etc. This is not unlike what electric guitarists have been doing for decades using pedals, but in works for instruments with electronics of the type that we are discussing here, the composer is able to control the effects in more precise and predictable ways. One common strategy is to create a custom software application with presets that are triggered at various points during the composition. One preset may simply cause the incoming sound to be delayed by, let's say, 4,000 milliseconds, while another may transpose the sound by 20 different intervals simultaneously. Live effects are often combined with pre-recorded sounds, for example, field recordings or maybe a drum track. In the program notes to Undertow, Lilios writes that the interactive electroacoustics turn the bass clarinet into a meta-instrument in which the instrument sound is expanded and enhanced based on the instrumentalist's input into the system. Here she refers to the fact that the electronics of a live component that is not pre-recorded. Let's talk about the notation. Works for instruments and electronics will typically, though not necessarily, be notated, since the performer is often someone who reads notation. The notation does sometimes need to be enhanced, if you will, with additional symbols and shapes used to, for example, indicate where a trigger needs to take place or to somehow give a graphic representation of the electronic sounds being heard. There are really as many approaches to notation as there are composers, and composers themselves may do different things in different pieces. This particular score uses a kind of time-space notation. This means that the rhythms indicated do not represent exact durations, but rather the performer has the freedom to determine when they play something based on where it is located in the score. In her notes, Lilios indicates that each system or line of music lasts approximately 55 seconds. Lilios uses lines to indicate that a note or chord is to be sustained and white space to indicate pauses. The circle numbers throughout the score indicate the current preset of the electronics. The term extended techniques is used often to describe unconventional instrumental or vocal techniques. The term unconventional here simply means that you probably won't find these techniques in the standard repertoire, such as the music of Mozart and Beethoven. Some contemporary composers, for instance Helmut Lachenmann and Salvatore Sciarrino, use all kinds of extended techniques. In fact, some compositions require nothing but extended techniques. Some examples of extended techniques for bass clarinet, which is the instrument you're about to hear, include multiphonics, where a performer is asked to use special fingerings to play more than one note at a time, multiphonics trills, timbre trills, where two different fingerings of a single pitch are used in rapid alternation, and various kinds of microtonal fingerings and sound effects. The fingerings provided in the score are special fingerings used for multiphonics. This is necessary because performers cannot be expected to know these fingerings by heart, though some specialized performers may know a large number of them and even use their own. Those of you familiar with notation may once again notice some unusual accidentals in the score. The use of unconventional accidentals here is different in sabbats in that it simply indicates the approximate pitches of the multiphonics to the nearest eighth tone. These accidentals are relatively common in contemporary music, and most performers who play this type of music will at least be somewhat familiar with them. Below the clarinet, the composer provides a graphic representation of the electronics. This is intended to be a visual reference for the performer, partly to help them ensure that everything in the electronics is working as it should. The text and arrows here indicate a gradual change, for example, a gradual speeding up and slowing down. Often composers use this type of indication to show gradual changes in color or playing technique. Starting at trigger 2, we find a number of double trills with various microtonal pitches. Note that here, too, Lilios provides the fingerings to make the performer's life easier, but also to ensure a more predictable result. As we already mentioned, the rhythmic duration has a certain degree of indeterminacy. There are several other examples of indeterminacy in this score, for example, just before trigger 6, where the performer is asked to, quote, insert repeating F-sharps ad lib, end quote, while playing a single multiphonic. Another example is found at the end. Here the composer tells the performer to improvise the final system using the score simply as a guide. Instrumental works with electronics will typically require various pieces of equipment to be performed. This will normally include one or more microphones, a computer, an audio interface, and loudspeakers. The computer will need to be equipped with a custom software called a patch that the composer will usually create themselves. In some cases, the performer will use some sort of foot pedal to trigger the various presets of the electronics, but these may be controlled by a separate performer. Lastly, a few words about the electronics. Pay attention to what happens at trigger 2. The performer plays a written low F. The bass clarinet sounds an octave and a whole step lower than is written, by the way. The computer captures the sound of the clarinet, then repeats it multiple times. This is done in real time. Let's now listen to Undertow by Eleni Lilios. Be sure to visit the composer's website to learn more about her work. And now on to the final part, sound art. The last work I want to share with you is by Colombian-American composer and sound artist Alba Triana. Triana studied traditional composition, but her work since about 2008 has focused on sound installations. While she does use traditional instruments in her work from time to time, for example in her 2016 collaboration with the Kronos Quartet, she uses them as sound-producing objects rather than as instruments that are played in a conventional way. The focus of her work is the exploration of the nature of sound in the different ways in which it can be experienced. Triana often creates systems that excite various objects or instruments, producing works that are highly captivating both visually and orally. Triana's pieces, to use her words, are to be heard, walked through, and seen. What we will see next is a video of a performance from her installation Music on a Bound String No. 1, a work Triana created in 2015. This is the first in a series of works that reference string musical instruments. In essence, the installation consists of a sculpture that includes a string held between 2 points. The string is excited by a signal produced by a loudspeaker. As the frequencies of the signal change, the string creates a visual representation of them. The signal emitted by the loudspeaker is too low for the audience to hear it, but the string allows them to experience the sound visually. Triana composed a piece for the sculpture the same way a composer might write for a traditional instrument. In fact, the structure of the work is relatively traditional, with phrases that begin, develop, and end. The difference is simply that the composition, again, is experienced visually rather than orally. In later works from the series, Triana uses other elements such as lights and resonators, adding additional layers to the work. This is how Triana describes the structure of the piece. She writes, quote, "The piece is divided into 3 sections. The first one composed by 4 phrases that start with discernible waveforms, blurring as they transit to the following phrase. The second section is composed by shorter phrases, gradually accelerating as they lead to the third part, characterized by complex sound waves that become denser and more active as it approaches the end of the piece. Even though the work is musically inspired, it manifests in the visual realm." I hope you enjoyed the work, and I hope you have enjoyed this talk. Be sure once again to visit Alba Triana's website to learn more about her fascinating work.